Howdy, y'all. I'm Matt, Chief of the Flutter Bounty Hunters. Welcome to On the Hunt, a Flutter podcast. Today, we're talking about why I think every user interface in the world should be built with Flutter. We're talking about why I am a Flutter maximalist. Get your Pepto-Bismol ready, because it's gonna be spicy.
We learn unique lessons about how to work with Flutter and Dart. And then we open source that work for the rest of the community. I am a Flutter maximalist.
Is competition a good thing? When I tell developers that Flutter should be the primary user interface toolkit for all user interfaces, I often receive a knee-jerk response about how important it is to have competition. Developers push this assertion that somehow it's preferable to have a bunch of competing UI toolkits because they say, quote, competition is good. You know, kind of like God is good. It's axiomatically true. Whatever competition yields, it must be better than the alternative, and we should preserve competition no matter the cost. But come on, this is wrong. Competition is good unless it isn't. For those who think competition produces the best results, help me understand the last 15 years of mobile development. At one point, we had mobile phone competition between iPhone, Android, Windows Phone, and BlackBerry. The mobile SDKs, or the mobile app SDKs, back then were atrocious. And also they're atrocious now, 15 years later. We began with 4 competitors, now we're down to 2. Each year, Google makes various announcements about the Android SDK. Most of those announcements are celebrations around making a terrible thing slightly less terrible. The most common announcement from the iOS team is that they've added some OS feature that Android has had since Gingerbread, like a million years ago. Or, equally prolific, are the announcements about revolutionary innovations in the area of emojis. So competition. Much wow. Even the honest efforts to innovate in Android and iOS have largely been a horror show. Each platform migrated to a modern language, Kotlin and Swift, respectively. Now, there's nothing wrong with those languages. Those are modern languages. I think, on the whole, they are good and effective languages. The problem is that when I say they migrate or migrated to those languages, the word migrate is misleading. It's not a migration, it's an amalgamation. Hundreds of millions of lines of Android code are still written in Java. The same is true for Objective-C. The attempt to move to a modern language has instead become a requirement to maintain knowledge of twice as many languages at all times. This same problem is playing out with Jetpack Compose and Swift UI. Rather than make a hard jump to a more effective way of operating, these so-called modern UI toolkits introduce all sorts of complexity to remain pluggable with the old, kludgy, cumbersome UI toolkits from 2008. Sure, these app SDKs are competing to improve mobile development, just like Democrats and Republicans are competing to improve the country. I will let you infer my opinion of Democrats and Republicans. For my web developer friends, perhaps you can interject here with the wonderful revolutions brought forward by competition in your space. Now, I should start out by giving an honest compliment to the world of web development. The world of web development brought us declarative compositional UI. That's actually a really big deal, and for that I'm honestly grateful. I commend their efforts in that area. But accepting the compliment for declarative compositional UI, let's get back to the competition dumpster fire, shall we? There is no industry in the world as competitive as that of web frameworks. Every 15 minutes, a new JavaScript framework is announced. If web developers had a nickel for every time they threw away perfectly good skills in favor of a new shiny object, they'd be long since retired. Now, with so much competition, surely, browser-based development must be light years ahead of everything else, right? Wrong. The web boasts an incrementally better developer experience than mobile in certain regards, and frankly, a worse experience in others. So on the one hand, web toolkits typically provide more composable and granular APIs than Android and iOS, giving web developers greater opportunity to paint custom interfaces. On the other hand, painting interfaces on the web is always reduced to HTML and CSS, which are inherently limited and very slow to change. So, one benefit, one drawback. Now, some people might mention canvas painting. Yes, there's canvas painting on web. Most web experiences use little or no canvas painting, so we're not yet at a point where that's a meaningful exception to the rule. How about build systems? Web frameworks use build systems that are typically, in my opinion, more dependable than mobile. But those build systems on web often require way more complicated configuration than Android and iOS. And that's especially true when comparing to Android. Android's build system is pretty darn simple, and most of the time it just works. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room. What's staring us right in the face when we talk about mobile and competition and success, web. When we talk about web and browser development and competition and success of web. Here's a question to ponder. Why aren't most mobile apps comprised of web views? And let's, get past the knee-jerk reaction, get past the emotional response. Let's really think about that. Web is this super competitive space, and people say competition produces better results. Why aren't most mobile apps comprised of web views? And it's because, to this day, a web experience on mobile devices simply doesn't feel like what users want or expect. After more than a decade of trying to make mobile web mainstream in app development, it remains the red-headed stepchild of the mobile world. Even Electron on desktop draws criticism and complaints. Now, historically, I've been a fan of Electron because the traditional desktop development is even worse than mobile. So Electron gave developers with more mobile and web-facing experience an opportunity to build for what has historically been the most common place to use interesting applications, which is the desktop. But despite that ability, there are plenty of people who have been very unhappy with Electron. And some companies have started with Electron and moved away. In the present day, I think Flutter completely blows the need for Electron away. I can't imagine using Electron over Flutter for desktop at this point, but Flutter wasn't always available on desktop, and so Electron had a role to play, and still Electron didn't win that market. So the web might beat Android and iOS development along certain dimensions, but if competition were inherently good, Android and iOS wouldn't even be in the same conversation as web. Web development would literally be 1,000 times better along every single dimension as compared to Android and iOS, but it's not. The web is a frothy mess. It's the epitome of toxic competition. But now let's get back to Flutter. Where was the competition that prompted the creation of Flutter? Flutter began as an experiment within Chrome. It didn't even have a clear objective, let alone a business model. When Flutter came to market as a UI toolkit for mobile apps, Flutter had no market share. And yet, Flutter wasn't fighting to survive. Instead, Flutter tossed itself into the market and let people decide what to use. Mobile developers gravitated to Flutter en masse. Not because Flutter was facing stiff competition, and not because Flutter was trying to push out the existing solutions. No. Developers adopted Flutter because Flutter was an order of magnitude more effective for building mobile user interfaces than the alternatives. Flutter was better without trying to be better. In fact, when I was on the Flutter team, developers regularly described Flutter in terms of React Native. I mean community developers. Developers assumed that Flutter was trying to compete with React Native. But the Flutter team always said the same thing about this. And I'm going to put this in my words, but it goes something like this. We don't pay attention to React Native. We're not trying to compete with React Native. We're working towards our own objectives, and we measure our success based on those objectives. Now, that statement wasn't just PR nonsense. I was there. It was true. We rarely, if ever, brought up React Native within the team. I don't recall a single situation where anyone on the Flutter team compared Flutter's performance or design or implementation to that of React Native. I never heard anyone discuss the goal of taking over React Native market share. We simply weren't focused on, quote, competing with React Native. In fact, funny enough, if Flutter really had competed with React Native, then Flutter probably wouldn't support Mac or Windows or Linux or web today. We'd be stuck in a world of hand-sized rectangles forever. That competition would have robbed the Flutter community of the majority of the value that Flutter would ever deliver. Now, the woes of competition aren't limited to the app industry. In fact, the most well-known example is probably the restaurant industry. Little known fact, there are almost as many restaurants as there are JavaScript frameworks. So, the competition is pretty intense. Now, despite all the frothy competition in the restaurant industry, which is supposed to be good, right? Well, prices still tend to move up rather than down. The big chains keep growing while the interesting mom and pop restaurants go out of business. And the idea of investing in restaurants is a running gag. It's a joke, or at best, a front for money laundering. So I think it's fair to say that competition doesn't always produce the best results. And if competition isn't universally good or superior, then we must always ask ourselves what we're giving up for the sake of competition. We must ask ourselves if it's worth it. Based on my history in the UX development industry, I'm a Flutter maximalist. Though it sounds completely backward, I believe the greatest gift that Flutter can give the world is monopoly. A UI toolkit monopoly gives us unity. It gives us true portability. Not just a portable runtime, I'm talking portable skills, portable careers, portable interests, portable motivations. We can work under one tent. We can all work together. No more separate teams, no more separate conferences, no more time spent relearning the exact same abilities with different toolkits. In the UX development industry, the cost of competition is just too damn high. It's time to face the music and acknowledge the contradiction staring us in the face. By constraining UI technologies, we would give UX developers the greatest freedom they've ever experienced. I'm going to say that again. By constraining UI technologies, we would give UX developers like you and me the greatest freedom we've ever experienced. To lose that freedom for the sake of, quote, competition would be a tragedy, because competition is good unless it isn't. Thanks for listening. I hope you'll join me as a Flutter maximalist, and y'all come back now, you hear?